this video, I'm going to cover the suspension install, the mounting and balancing of my new wheels and tires, and the track alignment. I've been coming to Monrovia Alignment for years, and that's because both David and Fern offer great service and fair prices. My first experience with David was when I brought in my 95 240SX and I had him readjust the ride height, corner balance the car, and realign it. After that, the car felt beautifully and I was sold. His level of attention to detail is what I appreciate because I am very meticulous myself. Over the years, they've added more and more services, but just to give a quick highlight, they do wheel alignments, road force balancing, suspension installs, tire services, TPMS sensors, corner balancing, and brake services. What makes Monrovia Alignment unique is that they work on everything from your everyday driver to your weekend driver to even your full track build. David has a dedicated track build Civic and he's always testing and tuning, trying to get the most out of it. And with his expertise, he can definitely understand how to set up different types of cars of all different variations. After getting to know him and seeing his work, I can definitely appreciate his expertise. So like I mentioned, I'm doing some suspension upgrades, and my goal is to really extract the most out of the stock setup, but really the car is limited by alignment. For those of you that are nerds like me and want to get into the specifics, at the very end of the video I included the weight of every single part, and I just kind of gave you a really close-up view of it. For you other 8.6 and BRZ owners, you know that the stock car is limited by camber, so I went ahead and got front upper top hats, front camber bolts, and rear lower control arms. The front spring and strut assembly had to be removed in order to get to the top hats, and I went with the aftermarket brand Pedders because it adds more caster and more camber. But it looks like OEM and it still retains the OEM NVH with the rubber insulation. Adding caster really just helps you center out the wheel after coming out of a turn. So the more caster you have, the quicker it centers out. For the camber bolts, I chose the brand Whiteline, and I chose the two sets that are a 14mm and a 16mm. Because if you offset the two camber bolts, top and bottom, you actually can gain the most out of your camber that you're trying to achieve. These are the rear OEM lower control arms. And the brand that I chose to replace them is by SPG, which you're going to see shortly. I like that these look OEM, but this aftermarket arm actually has additional holes. It's just for more adjustability. These rear arms actually came with an additional bushing that's offset, and that insert can actually add a little bit more adjustability, just depending on what you're trying to achieve. So I mentioned my goal is to keep as much of this suspension stock, but just to add more camber. So adding the arms, the camber bolts, and the top hats was a necessity. I originally had a different set of tires in mind, but I decided to go with this stickier tire for a couple reasons. And one being, I've actually never ran these Continental extreme contact forces before. And two, I'm actually testing a prototype oil pan, which we do need a little bit more G-forces to try out. So the wheels I decided to go with are by Apex. They're the VS5RS. In the 17x8 40 offset. I do have a video coming soon where I'm going to compare the Apex wheel to the two stock OEM wheels, and I'm going to be comparing the weight as well, so keep a lookout for that. So my intentions of the alignment were to get -3 camber up front, -2.5 in the rear, with a slight toe in the rear. After the car was dialed in, I went for a quick drive and I was really pleased with how it felt. I'm excited to see how it feels in the back roads and on track. Here's a view of the Pedders top hats from both sides. The OEM wheels were already a little sunken in, but with the added camber, it's even more sunken in, but I kind of like how it looks. Once I put the Apex wheels on, it's going to sit flush to the body, which is what the goal was. To my surprise, both David and Fern asked me if I wanted to be sponsored by their shop. Of course I said yes, and I was honored that they had asked me. I do go to the track frequently enough, so it was just a matter of getting their name out there. I was able to request the color of the letters, so with the theme of the car, I figured I'd go with the flat black and the gloss black look. I think it looks pretty sleek, if I say so myself. There are a lot of rear lower control arms out there that you can choose from in the aftermarket world, but my main goal was to not only keep the car as stock as possible as far as feel, but also look. So when you look behind the car and you actually able to poke underneath, you're not going to see any bright and shiny parts under there. As you can see, the bushing is still rubber with an aluminum sleeve in there. So you can still get a nice and tight dialed in feel without sacrificing NVH or lots of clunking and noise. So you can actually see that larger slot at the end to where you can actually allow for more alignment when you're trying to achieve more camber. I will be weighing both the aftermarket and the OEM parts just for reference so you can see the difference between them. So you can see how this hole is actually offset from the center. The OEM doesn't look like this. It's actually directly in the center. And the reason, like I mentioned earlier, was the goal is to attain more camber and more caster. So if you point it inwards, because depending on how you install it, you can achieve more or less. For the camber bolts, I chose to go with the Whiteline brand, and they're a very reputable company with suspension components. So this for me was a no-brainer to just choose them. So the reason I chose both the 16 and the 14mm bolts is because if you offset them correctly, putting the 14mm on bottom, 16mm on top, you can actually maximize your camber gain. In combination with your top hat, you'll get the most camber possible. And when I combine that with the top hats, I can get up to and more than -3 camber in the front. I was actually surprised to see that the OEM rear lower control arm was a little bit lighter, but only by a few ounces. These are the OEM bolts, and you can see they're pretty round, in comparison to the Whiteline bolts that have the notch in them to achieve that camber. Now, when you add that to the spring and strut assembly, you can add some adjustability, but the weight difference isn't too much. It's really just a couple ounces. You'll probably never feel a difference of ounces in weight difference, but you'll always feel the difference in lateral grip, especially when you're gaining the camber for turns. Again, I was shocked to see that the aftermarket parts were a little heavier than OEM, but at the end of the day, they're just ounces.